Hey guys, so recently I brought a video where I broke down the cost of the top decks in the current format. So I thought I'd do it again, but more so for tier 2 as well as some of the best rogue decks in the current format post Cyberstorm Access. So basically what I did was essentially just go through all of the card prices on TCG Player and map the prices out for at least using some of the topping deck lists as a guide. And so before I continue, big thanks to my sponsors as usual, links and discount codes below for Yu-Gi-Oh! Supplies. And so for the first deck that I'm going to put as the best deck of among tier 2 decks is Sprite, which did score 6 in my tier score by the data that you can also check out. And online, it's definitely seen a lot of decline in play, but it's still hanging in there and still seeing good amount of play, don't get me wrong. 50% win percentage though is certainly lower than before, and it was a tier 1 deck heading into this format, but now has quickly been forgotten and in the backseat now with some of the new decks in the format. But Sprite really consistent, lots of level 2s and rank 2s. Really cool plays that you can do. It can OTK pretty easily as well, on top of setting a pretty oppressive board too. So in terms of deck list, this is the one that finished first place at an Ireland National by Luke. And so I decided to sort of use the Evil Twin Sprite as a guide because I've been seeing a lot of that lately. And I also kind of wanted to do that to show that, you know, even if you have to buy the Evil Twin package on top of the Sprite stuff, it really doesn't really add too much in terms of cost. Now this particular deck list, of course, $540, pretty expensive, but if you look at sort of the side deck, for example, Kurikaras right now are really insane, and side deck, you can really swap them all out for something very cheap, and it would still be a very solid deck, or side deck rather. In terms of the main deck, it's not cheap, but it's definitely gone down a lot since the last format, and keep in mind, it was just tier 1 recently, and so Sprite Blues have been really dropping in price, and you also notice the Pot of Prosperity, which is also pretty expensive right now, but at the same time, you don't necessarily need it to play this deck. You can certainly get around without using it. And so if you sort of look at what you might consider as a deck core, so I sort of listed the Sprite and Evil Twin cards, at least this particular list did. Although I did throw in Sprint in there because I noticed the player wasn't using it, but it's certainly a very core card in the Sprite strategy, which is about $10. But you know what? This entire core being $100 is actually really good, considering that it's still a solid tier 2 strategy, and it's just, you know, you can play a lot of generic staples, which are, for the most part, you can find a really cheap replacements for. So I think this is another really good option to pursue if you're looking for a new deck to play, but not quite at the tier 1 level. Next we have Labyrinth, which is still hanging on, and actually it's kind of a weird trend with Labyrinth because basically at the beginning of last format it was really strong, and then it sort of started tanking in terms of representation, but now in this post Cyberstorm Access format it's still having a decent amount of representation, at least with regional tops. We do have the YCS happening this weekend and next weekend, so we'll see how it actually fares. But online, 59% win percentage, that's actually insanely high, and so for a backrow deck that's really not much you can ask for other than that. And so this is a deck list that finished first place at a Swiss Nationals by Jeremy. And so overall, the Labyrinth core itself is actually quite small, which you'll see soon. And in terms of deck cost, yes, this is around $400, but again, the Prosperity really ups the price for that. And also, you can also just fill in with like generic staples that are cheaper versions. And also, extra deck, technically, you can play with any kind of cards in the extra deck. I mean, ideally, you do want to have cards that will trigger when, you know, any of these extra deck monsters go to the grave through Dogmatic Punishment, so you can get some extra advantage out of it. But if you want to play on a budget, it's definitely doable. So if you basically look at the actual core of the Labyrinth, they don't have any extra deck specific monsters for Labyrinth, so really this is sort of what you would consider as a core. Of course, you need a bunch of generic traps and everything, but those for the by and large are not that expensive. There's usually common versions of all of those traps, and essentially it just kind of comes down to like Prosperity and your Dogmatica extra deck monster targets. But you know what, last time I did this video a few months ago, like Welcome Labyrinth were like $40 each, so it's really gone down a lot and has become a lot more affordable. And then next we have Sorcerer, which is sort of like the typical definition of a very solid deck, still hanging in there as in that tier 2 range. Win percentage wise, 48% is not amazing. Ideally you want to be at least 50%, and that's when you're still in a pretty solid category. But nonetheless, it's gotten a decent amount of regional tops, and actually this one finished second place at one of the regionals. And so Sorcerer lists are generally, I think, solid for the most part, the ratios for the core cards at least. This one in particular was a little bit more expensive because he was playing double thrust as well as the talent, which can definitely add up. And the extra deck is really honestly just comes down to Barone, which admittedly is kind of expensive, but if it's a generic card, so if you already have it, Sword Soul is another option you can get for quite cheap. So essentially, if you look sort of what you might consider as the core, which of course is kind of subjective in terms of what you might consider as a deck core, but you know what, under $70 for all of this, which is actually a pretty big engine for this deck, and then you can just fill it out with like hand traps or whatever board breaker cards that you want to play, and so it's really solid. So this and Sprite I would say are like like very cost efficient tier 2 strategies that you can run. Next we have Dragon Link, which, you know, if you saw my most recent meta-analysis of the top-rated Dueling Book players, this deck has certainly shown a lot of representation lately, which is kind of interesting. Regional top-wise, it hasn't performed that particularly well. It has a few tops, but definitely not as many as something like Branded or Labyrinth or Mathmech. And speaking of Branded, keep in mind that is not in this video because I already covered it in my last video a week ago in terms of top decks. Anyways, still 55% win percentage, really solid, really strong deck, has been for quite some time. And so if you look at the deck, it actually finished top 4 by Lure in the Israeli Nationals, and this is created by Ready for Duel. And I should have mentioned the other deck lists were compiled by Kalancha Store, which you should certainly check out those resources. And so Dragon Link, or Bestial Dragon, however you want to call it, usually pretty combo heavy. It does have a pretty decent grind game as well, and with the Bestials, it's been always kind of nice, although ironically enough, sometimes you can definitely brick on the Bestials, which I'm sure a lot of you have experienced back in the tier format. And so unfortunately, the deck itself is actually pretty expensive. This particular list was over $500. Of course, you know, even if you take out some of the generic staples, it's still kind of costly, because if you look here in terms of what you might consider as a deck core, essentially the Bestial Lubellion, they're still pretty expensive somehow, even though the deck that plays it more often, or rather in terms of, you know, general popularity, is Branded, and they only play one of it, but still really expensive. And so aside from that, you know, Warlord Savage is not too cheap either. So having this entire core for $300, definitely personally would not recommend if you're looking for more of a, you know, cost-friendly budget or tier 2 or solid meta contender, because, you know, if you saw my top deck breakdown, something like Super Heavy Samurai is much cheaper that you can build as a tier 1 strategy. So definitely I would say only pursue this if you really just love that dragon strategy, but otherwise cost-wise it's just not worth it in my view. And then we also have Punk, which is kind of interesting because online on Duelma, it's actually seeing a lot of play, although the win percentage wise, 43% is really low. And so tier score ranking wise, you know, 13th, it's not too bad. In terms of regional tops, one Gold Pride Punk, at least so far, since the Cyberstorm Access format has topped the regional. But other than that, I think it's still yet to be seen how well it's going to do at a YCS level. And in Portland regional, this actually came 3rd place. And so it's pretty solid. I actually also recently did a Punk, Gold Pride Punk deck profile as well that you can check out. So, you know, a decent amount of hand traps. And so unfortunately, this deck is also pretty expensive because of the Punk cards in general. Because of, I guess, the lack of reprints, it's pretty expensive. So this side deck was really low, which is nice. Again, side deck, you can always make it cheap. Extra deck, I think most of it, I'm actually surprised looking at it now, I'm realizing that this person was not playing Barone, which I think ideally you do play it from my understanding, and that will also increase the price quite a bit. So if you kind of just focus on the deck core, this alone is still around $200, which for, you know, like a rogue level deck is kind of expensive for a deck core. So certainly I would probably suggest something like Sword Soul or Sprite, which is more cost efficient, but again, it's a much different strategy than those ones, I guess. At least Sword Soul is also still synchro based, but this is kind of interesting too. So it has, and I think I kind of like this deck because it also has like a mix of, you know, monster effect kind of interruptions as well as back row, which is kind of nice and always hard to kind of side against in a way. So it's certainly an option for you if you're interested in this strategy, but just know that it is not a cheap deck. And lastly, we're going to cover Traptrix, which is still pretty popular, has had some decent regional success even now post Cyberstorm Access. And you know what, considering that it is still one of the more played decks online, and 49% win percentage among all players is actually really solid too. And so if you look at this one, which actually won 1st place at Australian Regional, and so this list in particular was playing Prosperity, which is why it's sort of driving that cost up, but really, you can technically play without it. I've definitely seen players play without it, or even just like one, if anything, and realistically, it's probably going to get hit on the ban list at some point, because the card is just way too good. And so it's a really cheap deck and a very cost efficient one. And so if you were to look at sort of like the deck core, like $11, that's just nothing. And at this point, you know, definitely do not buy these cards like separately, but just buy the 3 structure decks for 30, and you're going to get a bunch of the common traps and everything that you might need to really fill most of this deck. The Parallax Seed, you do have to get them separately, but they're not expensive at all. So this is definitely the best deck option to recommend, like as your first deck, for example, if you're kind of new to the competitive scene and you want to start with kind of like rogue deck because you don't want to invest too much into this game yet, just to see how you're going to fare with this Yu-Gi-Oh game. And so certainly this is the best deck to recommend, I think, to any new player, or even, you know what, even if you're experienced, this is still a solid deck to run. So anyways, that was it for the cost breakdown of some of the tier 2 slash some of the top rogue decks in the current format. Hopefully you found that interesting and helpful in terms of helping you decide play the next rogue deck or tier 2 deck that you want to run for this format. So as usual, big thanks to my Patreons for these continued support, and a big thanks to all of you for watching the video. So anyways, take care guys.